And opening arguments are expected to begin today in the trial of former White House strategist Steve Bannon. He's charged with 2 counts of criminal contempt of Congress. Scott MacFarlane is covering the federal trial in Washington, where jury selection began yesterday. Scott, good morning.
Anne-Marie, good morning to you. Steve Bannon's defense lawyers sought to delay this trial, arguing the publicity from the January 6th committee hearings would inflame or bias the jurors. But as the day begins, there are about 24 prospective jurors that both sides agreed are acceptable. They'll finish jury selection today and likely begin opening statements today. The prospective jurors all live here in the nation's capital. Some said they never heard of Steve Bannon. Some said they have watched the January 6th committee hearings, but that doing so wouldn't impact their ability to render a fair verdict. The big question today is when or if this week Steve Bannon takes the stand here at the courthouse in his own defense. I'll also note another significant deadline today. The U.S. Secret Service set to hand over text messages from January 5th and January 6, 2021 to the House January 6 committee under subpoena. An internal agency watchdog had warned some of those messages might have been deleted. Today, Anne-Marie, the committee is likely to find out how many messages were saved or preserved.
I'm going to ask you about the opening arguments, but before I do, you said that some people said they had never heard of Steve Bannon and they live in the Washington, D.C. area. I'm sort of curious because you sat in on jury selection. Any insight into sort of how these jurors were chosen? The types of people who were dismissed, what did you glean from the process?
Sure, there were a few dozen candidates, one at a time, walked into the courtroom. They took questions from the judge and from the attorneys out of earshot of the other prospective jurors. Steve Bannon right there in the room so they could lay eyes on him and say to the judge, "I've never heard of that guy." A whole series of prospective jurors said that. And those jurors largely were acceptable to both sides. We saw another juror come in and say, "I know who Steve Bannon is. I've been tweeting about him." What's more, that juror said, "I've heard about his case. It seems pretty simple. He was subpoenaed and he didn't honor the subpoena." That juror was excluded at the request of the defense attorneys. This is a process we become accustomed to here at federal court. The District of Columbia residents are frequently called for jury duty. They know the regimen here. And by the end of the day, there were a couple dozen jurors deemed acceptable. They'll winnow them out a little more narrowly to get down to 14, 12 who'll sit in the box and 2 alternates, likely by the end of the morning.
All right, so let's get down to what may start today, which are opening arguments. What are we expected to hear? What will jurors be listening for?
Well, the judge has already, in pretrial hearings, plucked away several of the defenses that Steve Bannon intended to muster. Steve Bannon was intending to call as witnesses the U.S. House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, the members of this January 6th committee. The judge says, no, they're not relevant to whether or not you failed to honor a subpoena with a date certain. Bannon has sought to argue that he made this 11th hour offer to sit down with the committee on the eve of trial. The judge left the door cracked on that. It's not certain he'll let Bannon make that argument, but here's the only defense the judge has left the Bannon team with. They can argue they didn't understand the deadline on the subpoena, which was October 7th, 2021. The defense indicates they may argue it was negotiable in Steve Bannon's mind, or flexible and not a date certain. The judge during pretrial hearings says he'll allow that defense to be entered, but it's far from clear how persuasive a defense that's going to be with 12 District of Columbia jurors.
Interesting. So on to the prime time January 6th hearing that's going to be happening on Thursday. We have a little idea of where it's going because we know of 2 people who are going to be testifying. Both of them worked in the White House. Both of them resigned right after the attack on the Capitol. How much of an impact could these witnesses have? Were they the types of people who would have been sort of quote unquote in the room when it happened?
What we know about these 2 witnesses that CBS News has confirmed will appear Thursday, Matt Pottinger, a former Deputy National Security Advisor, and Sarah Matthews, a former Deputy White House Press Secretary. What we've heard about them is that they resigned shortly after January 6th, that they were in the room or in the White House at some point and saw what was happening and what wasn't happening as the riot unfolded at the U.S. Capitol. What we know this committee is trying to do Thursday is show that former President Trump didn't act, didn't assume his duties as commander-in-chief and protector of the nation as the insurrection unfolded. They call it dereliction of duty. Pottinger and Matthews presumably could speak to what was happening and what wasn't happening during those pivotal hours.
Yeah, it should be interesting because we know in the last hearing, we heard testimony from at least two men who descended on the Capitol. One said he went there because the president told him to, and as soon as the president tweeted to go home, he dropped everything and went home. So, you know, what the president did and did not do will be significant. Scott, thank you very much.